I recently purchased the most popular glucose meter online and decided to test it with you. If you have...
So, friends, Special Counsel Jack Smith speaks, albeit behind closed doors, to Congress. Why behind closed doors? Because Representative Jim Jordan is afraid of the truth becoming public. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, Special Counsel Jack Smith was prosecuting Donald Trump for his crimes in multiple cases until Judge Aileen Cannon dismissed one case, and then the Supreme Court put a stop to virtually all prosecutions against Donald Trump. Then Representative Jim Jordan subpoenaed Jack Smith to appear before Congress, and Smith said, let's do it. Let's do it publicly for all the world to see. And Jim Jordan said, no, behind closed doors. And now we know why. Here's the new reporting about Smith's behind closed doors testimony. This from NBC News. Headline, Jack Smith tells Congress he could prove Trump engaged in a criminal scheme to overturn election. And that article begins, former Special Counsel Jack Smith told a congressional committee Wednesday that his team found proof beyond a reasonable doubt that President Donald Trump engaged in a criminal scheme to overturn the results of the 2020 election, according to parts of his opening statement obtained by NBC News. Trump also repeatedly tried to obstruct justice to keep secret his retention of classified documents found during an FBI search of his Mar-a-Lago estate in Florida, Smith told members of the House Judiciary Committee at a closed-door hearing. Smith said his team turned up powerful evidence that showed Trump willfully retained highly classified documents after he left office in January 2021, storing them at his social club, including in a bathroom and a ballroom where events and gatherings took place. House Oversight Committee Chairman Jim Jordan subpoenaed Smith to testify as part of Republican efforts to investigate the special counsel's office. Smith's investigation led to 2 indictments of Trump in the classified documents case and in the 2020 election interference case. Trump appointed U.S. District Judge Aileen Cannon dismissed the classified documents case in 2024, and a separate judge agreed to drop the 2020 case in November 2024 after Trump won re-election. Trump has repeatedly called for Smith to be prosecuted because, of course, he has. Facing a renewed wave of Republican attacks on his investigations into Trump, Smith was expected to try to use the hearing to correct what his team has described as mischaracterizations about the special counsel investigation. Smith had wanted to testify in a public hearing, but House Republicans refused to accommodate his request. After the hearing Wednesday, House Judiciary Committee Ranking Member Jamie Raskin joked that Jordan made an excellent decision in not allowing Jack Smith to testify publicly because, had he done so, it would have been absolutely devastating to the president and all the president's men involved in the insurrectionary activities of January 6th. Lanny Breuer, Smith's attorney, told reporters Wednesday that his client is showing tremendous courage in light of the remarkable and unprecedented retribution campaign against him by this administration and this White House. Pushing back against criticism of his team's decision to obtain and analyze the phone call records of 9 congressional Republicans, Smith told members of the committee that those records were lawfully subpoenaed and were relevant to complete a comprehensive investigation. This quote from Jack Smith, quote, "January 6th was an attack on the structure of our democracy in which over 100 heroic law enforcement officers were assaulted. Over 160 individuals later pled guilty to assaulting police officers that day," Smith said. Exploiting that violence, President Trump and his associates tried to call members of Congress in furtherance of their criminal scheme, urging them to further delay certification of the 2020 election. "I didn't choose those members," Smith added. "President Trump did." Friends, please put a pin in that. Special counsel prosecutor Jack Smith, when he lawfully subpoenaed phone records to see who Donald Trump was reaching out to in Congress to try to, keep them involved in his criminal scheme to stop the certification of Joe Biden's election win, Jack Smith subpoenaed those records because Trump chose those members of Congress to be part of his criminal scheme. That's what Jack Smith means when he says, "I didn't choose those members. President Trump did." Smith's report on Trump's efforts to overturn the election found that Trump inspired his supporters to commit acts of physical violence on January 6, 2021, and that Trump knowingly spread demonstrably, and in many cases obviously, false claims about the election as part of that effort. So, friends, I asked you to put a pin in that quote from Jack Smith because, as a career prosecutor, do you know how many times I made some variation of that argument to trial juries? So if I was prosecuting a criminal organization, a conspiracy with lots of co-conspirators, and, one or two or three, some number of those co-conspirators decided to plead guilty to what they did being part of the conspiracy, identify the other members of the conspiracy and the crimes they committed, and then testify at trial. The defense attorneys would be beating up on these cooperating witnesses who, in my estimation, had decided to do the right thing. They were doing wrong back in the day. They decided, for whatever reason, often to try to win reduced charges or a lesser sentence, but still, they had to be telling the absolute truth, and I had to be able to corroborate with independent evidence everything they said about what the co-conspirators did. If it wasn't truthful testimony, I didn't want it, I didn't need it, I wouldn't use it, and I wouldn't present it to the jury. But the defense attorneys would beat up on these cooperating witnesses. "Sir, you committed this crime and that crime, and it was horrible, and you victimized these people, and you sold those drugs, and you ran these guns, and you did all these horrible things." And they would cross-examine the cooperating witnesses, trying to convince the jurors that, "Oh, you can't credit that testimony, you can't believe them," when they say, "My client was a co-conspirator who did X, Y, and Z, committed all these crimes." And I would get up in my rebuttal argument. I would say, "Ladies and gentlemen, we didn't pick that witness. The prosecutor didn't go out to the witness store and said, just give me a co-conspirator off the shelf who can incriminate the defendant that I'm trying. Who picked that person to do crime with? The defendant." And that's why we presented the testimony of that witness. He was the one who saw the defendant committing these crimes because they were part of the same criminal conspiracy together. The same argument holds true when we maybe have a witness who, murders often occur in dark alleys late at night with compromised human beings, becoming witnesses in cases. Maybe they're drug addicted, maybe they're struggling with mental health challenges, but they are the people who witnessed the crime. So those are the people we call to present evidence to the jury to try to prove the crime. And what does the defense attorney do? Cross-examine the witness. You're a drug addict and you got mental health problems, and, try to tear them down and tear them down and tear them down, which is a defense attorney's job. And then the defense attorney would argue, prosecutor brings you a drug-addicted, mental health-challenged witness like that. You can't believe that person. What would I argue in rebuttal? Ladies and gentlemen, the government, the prosecutors don't pick the witnesses. You know who picked that particular witness? The defendant. Because it was in front of that witness that the defendant decided to take a human life. So this is a variation on that old argument that the Republicans are making. Can you believe that Jack Smith subpoenaed the phone records of members of Congress on January 6th to see who Donald Trump was calling? First of all, phone records are obtainable by a subpoena. And because it was relevant to Donald Trump's criminal scheme, which members of Congress during and after the January 6th Capitol attack he was contacting to say, keep objecting to the certification, keep objecting, keep objecting. They're co-conspirators. They're part of Donald Trump's criminal scheme. And now these Republican members of Congress and Jim Jordan, it's outrageous that they got cell phone records which didn't record their conversations. It didn't include their voices. It simply said this number, phone number, contacted this phone number at this time, and the connection lasted 2 minutes and 42 seconds. That's it. That's the information they got. So then Jack Smith could appropriately, perform a comprehensive investigation, subpoena the people who Donald Trump spoke with and said, ask them, what did Donald Trump tell you to do? Inferentially, as part of his criminal scheme to try to retain power, even though he lost an election. Remember when they asked Jim Jordan that question? When did you talk to the president? And he went, hamana, it was before, maybe it was after, hamana, right? It's a little something we call consciousness of guilt. So you need those phone records to know which witnesses might be part of Donald Trump's criminal scheme and what did Donald Trump tell them to do. Nothing about that was improper. It was good law enforcement investigative practice, which is why the Republicans don't like it. But I suspect, and I certainly hope, we're going to see a transcript of Jack Smith's behind closed doors testimony to Congress. It wouldn't have the impact as if we got to watch Jack Smith deliver it live with our own eyes on TV, and that's precisely what Jim Jordan did not want to have happen, which is why Jim Jordan was all big and bad when he was subpoenaing Jack Smith, and then Jack Smith said, let's do it publicly, and Jim Jordan said, no, I don't want anybody to see what you're saying. But Jack Smith wanted to do it publicly. Why? Because justice matters. Friends, we're headed in the right direction. Please stay safe. Please stay tuned. And I look forward to talking with you all again tomorrow. So friends, we now know Mark Meadows testified in the grand jury about, and in a very real sense, against Donald Trump. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, there has been a huge development in the investigation into Donald Trump's crimes, because we now know that Trump's former chief of staff, Mark Meadows, testified before special counsel Jack Smith's grand jury. Let's start with the new reporting. This from the New York Times. Headline, Mark Meadows testified to grand jury in special counsel investigation of Trump. And that article begins, Mark Meadows, the final White House chief of staff under President Donald Trump and a potentially key figure in inquiries related to Mr. Trump, has testified before a federal grand jury hearing evidence in the investigations being led by the special counsel's office, according to two people briefed on the matter. Mr. Meadows is a figure in both of the two distinct lines of inquiry being pursued by the special counsel appointed to oversee the Justice Department's scrutiny of Mr. Trump, Jack Smith. One inquiry is focused on Mr. Trump's efforts to cling to power after losing the 2020 election, culminating in the attack by a pro-Trump mob on the Capitol during congressional certification of the Electoral College results on January 6, 2021. The other is an investigation into Mr. Trump's handling of hundreds of classified documents after he left office and whether he obstructed efforts to retrieve them. It's not clear precisely when Mr. Meadows testified or if investigators questioned him about one or both of the cases. And friends, let me take a brief pause in the New York Times reporting because ABC News has some additional reporting that updates this New York Times story. Sources tell ABC News that Meadows answered questions on both Trump's efforts to overturn the 2020 election and Trump's alleged mishandling of classified documents. So the ABC News reporting makes clear that Meadows testified about both investigations. Let's go back to the New York Times reporting. For months, people in Mr. Trump's orbit have been puzzled by and wary about the low profile kept by Mr. Meadows in the investigations. As reports surfaced of one witness after another going into the grand jury or to be interviewed by federal investigators, Mr. Meadows has kept largely out of sight, and some of Mr. Trump's advisors believe he could be a significant witness in the inquiries. Mr. Trump himself has, at times, asked aides about how Mr. Meadows is doing, according to a person familiar with the remarks. Now, friends, we've got a lot to unpack here, but let me start with this. When I read this New York Times reporting, the first thing that came to mind is some reporting from nearly a year ago now. This from Rolling Stone. Headline, Trump's lawyers think Mark Meadows is going down. And that article reads in part, Trump's inner circle increasingly views Meadows as a likely fall guy for the former president's attempts to overturn the 2020 election. Members of Trump's legal team are actively planning certain strategies around Meadows' downfall, including possible criminal charges. Trump has himself begun the process of distancing himself from some of his one-time senior aides' alleged actions around January 6th. So nearly a year ago, Trump and his lawyers were looking to make Mark Meadows the fall guy, looking to have Meadows take the fall for Donald Trump and the crimes he, Trump, had committed. And all of a sudden, Mark Meadows makes himself scarce, goes off grid. So much so that even Donald Trump starts asking those around him, how's Mark? Haven't heard from him in a while. Well, that's not a surprise, sport, because you and your lawyers were trying to put the beef on him, put the blame on him, make him the fall guy for your crimes. And now we know Mark Meadows went into the grand jury and testified about both criminal investigations of Donald Trump, the January 6th attack on the Capitol, the insurrection, and Trump's classified documents crimes. And friends, that is undoubtedly a great development. Why? Because Mark Meadows sat at the knee of the mob boss, Donald Trump. He can testify about where the bodies are buried. He has firsthand information and can give a firsthand account of the crimes committed by Donald Trump. But there is still one enormously consequential question that we don't have the answer to yet. In what capacity did Mark Meadows testify? Did he testify as a cooperating witness, or did he testify as an immunized witness? And those are two very different kinds of witnesses. So for this discussion, you might want to sit back, get comfortable. We're going to have to go to a team justice law school class for just a few minutes, because I want to talk about the dramatic difference between cooperating witnesses and immunized witnesses. And I dealt with many of both kinds of witnesses in my 30 years as a federal prosecutor. So first of all, Mark Meadows has a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Why? Well, because we've seen so much reporting about how, for example, he was basically acting as, the switchboard for Treason Central. Mark Meadows, how can I direct your treasonous call or text? Oh, Ginny Thomas, wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, you're saying that we need to have Donald Trump overthrow our democracy, change the results of the election so he can remain president, notwithstanding the vote of the American people? Gotcha. Let me pass on your message. We know he took tons of messages like that. We know he helped, he aided, he assisted, he facilitated Donald Trump in his crimes. We know, based on the January 6th Select Committee hearings, that he told his aide, Cassidy Hutchinson, look, Donald Trump knows his angry mob is attacking the Capitol and hunting for elected officials and threatening to hang Mike Pence. He doesn't think they're wrong because Mike Pence didn't corruptly throw him the election, so I'm not going to try to stop any of it. I mean, those are just a couple of examples of the potential criminal exposure of Mark Meadows. Remember when he would meet with, I believe it was Representative Scott Pardon Me Perry, and after the meeting, or after the meetings, what would Meadows do? He would burn documents in his fireplace, inferentially destroying evidence of criminality, on and on and on. So I think we can comfortably conclude, based on everything that's been reported, Mark Meadows has a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. What does that mean when you have a Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination? It means if you're subpoenaed to the grand jury, you can decline to answer questions. You can lawfully and constitutionally invoke that important right under the Fifth Amendment not to testify if your truthful testimony would tend to incriminate you. So Mark Meadows has a very good lawyer. And undoubtedly, when Meadows was presented to the grand jury by Jack Smith and his prosecutors, he would have pled the Fifth, invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. That gave Special Counsel Jack Smith a choice. What do I do to try to extract the testimony from Mark Meadows that I want to extract because it will help me prove the crimes of Donald Trump? Well, he had a couple of ways he could go with Meadows. One, he could charge Meadows with the crimes he committed. He could negotiate with Meadows' criminal defense team and have Meadows plead guilty, agree to cooperate fully and truthfully against everyone about whom he had incriminating information, and Meadows would have to agree to testify before both the grand jury and the trial jury. So he could have struck a plea agreement with cooperation, which would have morphed Mark Meadows into a cooperating witness. That is the preferred way to deal with people who commit crime, but you want or you need them to testify about the crimes of others to help, build your way up the criminal ladder and get the mob boss, the biggest criminal fish, Donald Trump. There's another way that Jack Smith could have gone with Mark Meadows. If you want to extract the testimony from Meadows, but he pleads the Fifth, you can extinguish his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. You can overcome it by granting him immunity, by immunizing him and telling him nothing you say can be used against you because I am immunizing you against prosecution. You will not be prosecuted for your crimes, so now you must answer the questions before the grand jury that would incriminate yourself, technically, and Donald Trump. That is not the favorite approach, and here's why I say that, friends. Because if you are giving a guy like Mark Meadows a pass, a former chief of staff, among the highest government officials in our federal government, you give him a pass for his crimes, how credible will his testimony be about the crimes of Donald Trump? Here is how a defense attorney would cross-examine Mark Meadows if he testified under a grant of immunity, if he was given a pass for all of the crimes he committed, no accountability for those crimes. Defense attorney would ask Meadows, among other things, let's see, you committed obstruction of justice, you were involved in a conspiracy, you basically committed any number of crimes designed to end our democracy and install Donald Trump into the presidency for a second term unlawfully and unconstitutionally. And had you been convicted of those crimes, you would have died in prison, decades and decades of potential jail time if you had been convicted. But that prosecutor sitting right there gave you a pass. That man is your best friend. He is your savior. He's your patron saint. He gave you a deal that meant you would never have to serve 1 minute of accountability, 1 minute of jail time for the crimes you committed, correct? And now you want the jury to believe anything out of your mouth that you say about the crimes of Donald Trump? You would say anything you have to say to please that prosecutor who is your patron saint, who kept you out of prison, who gave you a pass for all of your egregious crimes. That would be for openers. That would go on for hours and probably days on cross-examination of Mark Meadows if he was given immunity, if he was given a pass for his crimes. That is the disfavored approach of extracting information and evidence and testimony out of somebody who committed crimes. So the question becomes, which way did Jack Smith go to secure the testimony of Mark Meadows? Because, as I say, Mark Meadows has to be either a cooperating witness or an immunized witness, because those are the two ways you can overcome his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. I'm quite sure Mark Meadows didn't just waltz into the grand jury footloose and fancy-free without an immunity deal and without being a cooperating witness and say, yes, let me just tell you everything I know truthfully, honestly, accurately, and fully about my crimes and the crimes of Donald Trump. Doesn't work that way, friends. That's why we have defense attorneys, and it's a good thing the Sixth Amendment provides everybody with a right to effective counsel. That's the way it should be. So Jack Smith had to do something to overcome Mark Meadows' Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. Here's the thing. Jack Smith, who was first the head of the Public Integrity Section at the Department of Justice, and whose team tried really challenging politically charged cases, and they won some and they lost some. Give me a prosecutor who's not afraid to lose, but is willing to take the difficult public corruption cases to trial, win, lose, or draw, because it's more important to try those cases than to win those cases, to serve as a deterrent to other corrupt politicians who might be contemplating committing crimes. Give me a prosecutor like that, fearless, a real without fear or favor guy, who's even willing to lose a case every now and then. That's the kind of person I want to jump into the prosecutorial foxhole with and fight the enemy being the political criminals, the ruling class criminals, the corrupt politicians.
And then he went to The Hague thereafter to prosecute war crimes and war criminals. He didn't go to private practice to, line his pockets. He went to The Hague. Those are some pretty good credentials and a demonstrable dedication to public service and the rule of law and to holding the ruling class criminals accountable. So if I had to bet $1, which is my betting limit, I'm not a high roller. If I had to bet $1, I would bet that the way Jack Smith went was he negotiated a guilty plea under seal, so we don't know about it yet. It's appropriate to do that, keep it under seal until a later date after all the indictments have been returned against Trump and company. He may have pleaded guilty under seal, Mark Meadows, agreed to cooperate fully and truthfully against others, and in that capacity, he testified before the grand jury. And that's how you keep Mark Meadows' credibility high, so his testimony will be believable to a jury. There are other ways to make testimony believable. You have to corroborate it with all sorts of other evidence and information like text messages and emails and audio recordings and the testimony of others, right? The more corroboration you have of a witness, the more likely the jury is going to be to believe that witness. But again, I have to believe Jack Smith was not willing to give a criminal chief of staff to the President of the United States a pass, give him immunity so that he could secure his testimony. Remember Bob Haldeman, Richard Nixon's chief of staff who committed crimes covering up the Watergate scandal? What happened to him? He went to trial. He was convicted of perjury and conspiracy and obstruction of justice, and he went to prison. Rather than give Mark Meadows immunity, I would have far preferred that Jack Smith, if he wasn't going to give him a plea deal with cooperation, just take him to trial, get him convicted. Do what the prosecutors did to Bob Haldeman, the last criminal chief of staff to a president of the United States. He was held accountable. He didn't get an immunity deal. But I have a feeling Jack Smith made the right call. I presume he made the right call. I wouldn't presume he made the wrong call. And I think we will know within the coming months precisely what status Mark Meadows was in when he appeared before the grand jury and testified about the crimes of Donald Trump. Because, friends, we're getting there. It's coming. We're gonna see indictments, probably sooner rather than later, probably first for the classified documents crimes, and then for the insurrection. We're getting there. Because justice matters. Friends, thank you for bearing with me through that long Team Justice Law School class. I'm sure there will be many more long Team Justice Law School classes in our future as we move into this next phase, this important era in our history, in the life of our nation, which I am calling the Trump trials, because that is what we will be discussing probably for the next 2 to 3 years, the Trump trials. And I, for one, will be here for all of it. Friends, as always, please stay safe, please stay tuned, and I look forward to talking with you all again soon. Well, friends, I attended Donald Trump's appellate court hearing today on his nonsensical claim that a president has absolute immunity from being prosecuted for any and all crimes he commits while in office. And I can tell you, today was a decidedly bad day in court for Donald Trump. Let's talk about that, because justice matters. Hey all, Glenn Kirshner here. So friends, again today, I had the pleasure of going back to my old stomping grounds, the courts of Washington, D.C., specifically